Hey everyone, Draco Magnius here for something a little different today. Today we're going to be covering the novellas of Drakengard 1. A little bit about that, I was wandering around the internet I don't remember exactly when I did this, but I was wandering around the internet and I learned about these novellas. For anyone who still has no idea what the hell I'm talking about, the novellas provide more insight about the background of the main characters from the Drakengard series. Most of them are written by, I might say this name wrong, Jun Ishima. But there's a total of 8 different novellas. 7 of them cover our main characters, I think just before Drakengard happens. And the 8th one covers 14 years before Drakengard 1, when Kaim and Inuart and Furii are all much younger. When they're all, I'm pretty sure, teenagers at that point. I don't recall off the top of my head how old they are, but you'll have to trust me on that. It was a long time ago. Another little tidbit with these novellas and these videos in general, well, I say videos, but I'm not sure how many there are going to be. For this particular video that we're starting right here, I don't know if I'm splitting it into parts or not, because there's 7 different character novellas to cover. So I might split it into 2 parts, we'll have to see how long this video goes. And the Song of 14 Years, which is the 8th one, and the one I said that takes place in the distant past, that one's getting its own video because that one's pretty long. Another little tidbit, Drakengard 2 also has a novella. It's called The Garden of Light, and if I'm not mistaken, that takes place roughly... Well, not roughly. There's no exact time period, I don't think. Maybe it takes 2 years after ending A, I think? I'm pretty sure it takes place after ending A, but we'll cover that one in the video that we actually cover it. For now, we have some novellas to go through, starting with Kaim's novella. So I'm going to cut this here. I'll be right back with you in just a moment. Kaim. From Drakengard Official Guidebook, Complete Edition. Translation by Kestrel. Burning in the flames of revenge, he becomes a demon of battle. When did the gears first deviate from their course? It was not something Kaim would ask himself. Surrounded by his strict yet caring father, his kind mother, and his sweet and lovely sister, he led a happy life in those days. His childhood friend and sword-fighting rival Inuart eventually became his brother-in-law. Someday he would succeed his father in governance of the kingdom of Carlion, and he'd appoint Inuart onto his staff. He held dreams such as this. However, for the Kaim of today, there is nothing. In retrospect, the incident that occurred the day before that terrible tragedy could have very well been an omen. During their usual sword practice, Inuart accidentally managed to injure Kaim. Fortunately, it was a shallow wound, and Kaim laughed it off as his friend's enthusiasm for their training. However, Furii did not. She scolded Inuart with a surprisingly threatening attitude, and the defeated Inuart, with an unpleasant look on his face, took his leave of the place. Although glad, Furia's brother was inwardly troubled. Well, maybe I should talk with her about it later. So thinking, Kaim led his younger sister, who was so worried it seemed she would burst into tears at any moment, back to the castle. However, the complex look he'd seen in Inuart's eyes as he left was something that Kaim of this moment had no reason to understand. And the next day, the tragedy occurred. That spectacle was something he would probably never be able to forget. His father's body being slowly crunched between the ugly teeth of the black dragon that had suddenly attacked the castle. His mother's body easily pierced by its gigantic claws. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. Having accomplished its goal, the black dragon glanced at Kaim and his sister before calmly flying away from that place. Kaim howled, and he continued to raise his voice as he howled to the point his lungs would surely give out. How long he stayed like this is unknown. Suddenly coming back from himself, Kym saw by his side, overwhelmed with surprise and despair. Furii was standing in a daze, having forgotten how to scream or to cry. Kym pulled her into an embrace. He noticed then that Furii was trembling all over, and he hugged her even tighter. 6 years have passed since then. Family, friends, and home no longer exist. Kym has nothing now but daily combat. With unaffected determination, he kills his opponents. The thrill of battle helps him forget reality. Now, revenge has for Kym become an excuse with which to kill his opponents. Anger flows through his body, and always his heart is as empty as the void. Furii, having severed relations with earthly life, the goddess lives in suffering. The goddess's daily life is filled with tedium. Mornings, she wakes up in the ever-gloomy house, and together with Verdalay, lifts up prayers to God. As day breaks, she finishes a frugal meal, after which there's nothing particular for her to do. When she'd just become the goddess, scriptures and theology books and the like were placed in her room, and she'd looked through them out of idle curiosity. However, as the contents of each and every one of them was nothing but stiff and formal text, she quickly lost interest. The furnishings were extremely modest. The stiffness of the bed surprising her more than anything, the room was equipped with all the necessities of daily life. But there was not one object that could possibly be considered good for amusement. As a princess who had been raised in an environment devoid of discomfort, life as the goddess was akin to torture. But the fact of the matter is that I chose this life myself. So Furii bit back her complaints. She didn't want to remember it ever again, and yet, even now, when she closed her eyes, the scene of the tragic day would rise unbidden to her mind, the scene that had changed everything. Her kind and cheerful brother had become someone who brooded most of the day, and rarely ever smiled. She sometimes heard screams coming from his room in the dead of night. The next day, if asked about it, Kym would answer only with, "I had a bad dream." Furii could not give her aid to such a brother. Inuart, Furii's fiancé, worried over them as well, and came to visit countless times. However, even the sound of his harp playing could no longer move her heart to the degree that it once had. Before she knew it, she too had begun to close the doors of her heart, just like her brother Kym. A year after the tragedy, the siblings were separated from their country. Inuart had invited her to go with him, but Furii was worried, having seen Kym's condition up close, and could not afford to leave him alone. However, that may have been an excuse of her own making. Her true feelings spoke thus, though she was not entirely aware of it herself. "I don't want to be separated from brother!" However, immediately upon starting their journey away from the country, something unusual arose within Furii's body. Pain racked the girl's body, and the mark of the goddess appeared. Becoming the goddess meant isolation from the world. If this were to happen, she would never be able to meet her brother or Inuart again. For Furii, this was a fate too cruel to bear. "Why must I be the only one caught in such a—" Several days after the mark had appeared, Furii decided to become the goddess. She told her brother this, in her usual peaceful tone, with her mouth even shaped into a smile. However, those eyes were terrifyingly empty. That was only natural. At the age of only 14, the girl was forced to give up everything. Inuart, single-minded desire begins to devour him unaware. In the moonlight shining through the window of his room, a solitary young man was lost in thought. The young man, with his lean, well-trained body, good looks, and longish red hair, was a great man who could certainly arrest the eyes of all the women he passed in town. However, contrary to his awe-inspiring, manly appearance, his thoughts were sunk into a dark depression. He wanted to go back to that time. Kine treated him with affection, without an atom of regard for the difference in social statuses, and Furii was always beside them, smiling softly at the two. Hampered by the weight of his furiously beating heart, he stumbled over his words countless times in an attempt to confess his love, and when Furii responded with a blush, he felt as if he had risen to heaven. Everything shone back in those days. However, something began to change after that horrific tragedy. With Kime having closed off his heart after his parents were killed before his eyes, Furii worried over her brother, to the point that whenever she and Inuart were together, her mind was in another place entirely. Inuart, in order to be helpful to them where he could, helped his father Ypres, who had taken over administrative duties in his work. Despite this, a year after Gop's death, Ypres died of illness. The 3 people he had left behind in adversity thus decided to leave the country. The grief at the loss of his father was great, but within Inuart's heart was a secretively joyful thought. This way I can finally be together with Furii! But his expectations failed when the hard reality was thrust before him. Rather than being Inuart's fiancée, Furii had chosen to stay with her brother Kine. While he accepted this with apparent calmness, Inuart was inwardly shaken and discouraged to an immeasurable degree. Why must she choose Kime over me? Inuart's heart was filled with whirling jealousy as he cursed himself for his inability to support them. He sat alone in the now empty palace, playing his harp. Having lost Furii, whom he loved, the man had nothing left to his name but his songs. And immediately afterwards, when the mark appeared on Furii, his fiancée went somewhere his hands could never reach. Inuart's dreams of a brilliant future had been lost for all eternity. Several years after that, in this disturbed age, Inuart spent his days fighting as a member of the Union Army. The sword skills he'd once forged together with Kime now served more useful than ever in this environment. However, his heart was constantly troubled with his thoughts. If I had more power, then Furii would... I wish for more power! A dog's howl could be heard from somewhere, snapping the young man out of his thoughts. Inuart slowly raised his body from the bed, taking his harp from where it lay against the wall, and quietly began to play. That melancholy tune did not cease until dawn. Sere, the boy with eternal youth, becomes the owner of a pure spirit. I loved only you. Sere opened his eyes when he felt his mother's presence. Mother? Mother, where are you? If you're here, then answer me! But of course, instead of his mother's figure, the boy's worried gaze found only Golem there. Sere, crestfallen, lowered his head and mumbled to himself with a great sigh. A dream again. Ever since that day, his mother would always appear in his dreams without fail when he slept. Kind and beautiful mother, mother who loved only me. But that mother wasn't here anymore. His father is lowered now. Sere was all alone. Sarai alone. Wrong. Having read his thoughts, Golem humbly protested. Sarai floated a smile, holding on to the craggy body, and pressed his cheek to his only friend in the world as he replied, "That's right, isn't it? Thank you, Golem." So saying, he extended his tiny arms as far as he could and embraced Golem's gigantic leg, staying like that for a short moment. Mother used to always embrace Sarai like this. Mother's breast was warm and soft and smelled very nice. Since I'm tiny, I can't do it like that. But Golem is an important friend, so I want to give him a hug just the way Mother used to. And so like that, before he knew it, Sarai had fallen asleep. Having noticed the faint breathing that signified sleep, Golem's great hand moved slowly, gently placing Sarai's little body on the soft meadowland beneath the shade of a rock. That movement seemed very much in appearance like that of a mother towards her own child, filled with deep affection. The next morning, when Sarai opened his eyes, Golem's figure was not by his side as he had expected. Golem? Golem! At his involuntary shout, Golem's figure slowly appeared from the shade of the rocks, a short ways off. Sarai was relieved, but also wondered what Golem had been doing. Found same smell as Sarai. Sarai was taken aback by those words. Right now, the two of them were near the valley that his long-lost sister Mana had been abandoned in. Golem, with its monster sense of smell, must have caught his sister's scent. Mana, who had received not one bit of mother's love. Sarai, living in a haze of love from his mother, had forgotten about his sister. And finally, Mana was, "I have to find Mana. And then, I have to apologize." Sarai slowly stood up. Within his eyes shone the strong light of determination. Adios. Despair transformed the lone housewife into a monstrous murderer. Recently, the serial murderer that had so troubled society was captured. This news spread like wildfire across the kingdom of Niflheim. Moreover, the fact that the perpetrator was a perfectly ordinary elven housewife gave the people a great shock. Considering the fact that she'd aimed only at children, several victims had already come out, and so when the chance came to see this cruel figure, everyone gathered to see her profile. Word having spread that the criminal named Ariosh was being transferred from the town jail to a prison in the desert. Crowds of people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of this bizarre figure who had committed such an unprecedented crime. "I bet she's a monster woman that looks like an ogre." "Nah, I hear she looks like a 300-year-old granny." The crowd was filled with such irresponsible rumors. However, when the criminal appeared, led by soldiers of the Imperial Army, her figure completely defied their expectations. What appeared was not a monster, nor a decrepit old witch, but an incredibly ordinary, yet beautiful young elven woman. The hideously atrocious female cutthroat that the crowd had been expecting was nowhere to be found. The previously raucous crowd went quiet, one by one, as if they'd all been caught in a still photograph. And the place was wrapped in a bizarre sort of silence. For these people, the criminal who had murdered defenseless innocents time and time again, and the elf woman before their eyes, were two beings they could not manage to connect no matter how hard they tried. There was nothing but the sound of the soldiers' footsteps echoing as the crowd sent them off, swallowing their collective breaths. However, Ariosh saw nothing of what was going on around her. Held by sturdy soldiers on both sides, walking as if she was being dragged, she muttered the same words over and over again. "My children. Delicious children." Even when her body was tightly bound and she was placed into the prison, Ariosh did not resist once, so docile that her jailers were unnerved. The girl did not seem to understand what was happening to her. Where is this place? Where did my adorable children go? Give me back my children! Suddenly, Ariosh let out a scream that seemed to resound throughout the entire prison. A jailer holding a gag rushed into the prison as fast as he could, at the hair-raising noise. He must have been negligent due to her meekness back then. When the jailer moved to place the gag in her mouth, Ariosh snapped at him with blinding speed. In the next instant, she had bitten his fingers off without the slightest hesitation. This time it was the jailer's screams that echoed throughout the halls. The girl smiled as if satisfied, leisurely swallowing the object in her mouth. Leonard. His unique inclinations torment the fastidious hermit. It happened shortly before Leonard went through puberty. His friends had already gone through the change in voice themselves, and little by little, Leonard went through that change from boy to adult as well. When the boys around that age gathered together, talk would naturally turn to gossip about the opposite sex. Which girl is cute? Oh, I think that girl is nice. In the midst of his friends' excitement in their childish arguments, Leonard alone had no interest in such tedious chatter. If they were to talk about the girls they liked, it was a single boy's profile that filled his gaze. This flaxen-haired boy stood out amongst his friends as having particularly handsome features. When Leonard gazed at him, a mysterious warm feeling rose up in his chest. What a beautiful face that is! At that moment, having felt his gaze, the boy suddenly turned and spoke to Leonard. Come to think of it, how about you, Leonard? Taken off guard as he was, Leonard could say nothing at the moment, blushing as he turned his gaze downwards. Seeing him like that, his friends laughed at the strange guy, and then turned back to their talk of the opposite sex. While Leonard mentally breathed a sigh of relief, it became clear to him then that he was different from his friends. Nearly 20 years have passed since then. This unique disposition, this love of boys, continued to torment Leonard, and he began living in the forest as a hermit. At first, he separated from his family and lived alone, but because of their being chased by the Imperial Army, he now gave shelter to his 3 younger brothers. Of course, not a single person in his family knew about his leanings. However, he could no longer restrain the desire that had heaped upon itself over the years, and would sneak into the woods behind the house to pleasure himself outside his brother's notice. Thus he passed the days. I cannot do this forever! Coming home from the woods, he would think this each time he saw his brother's faces, but ultimately he succumbed to the weakness of his own heart. Then the fated day came. That day, as usual, when it got dark, Leonard quietly snuck out of the house. With the pain of corruption stinging in his chest, and filled with expectations of pleasure, he quickened his pace and headed towards the forest. Then, when Leonard's figure had completely vanished into the woods, soldiers with eerily glowing red eyes gathered before his house. His brothers, who noticed them outside the window, each called out for their brother to help them, but the voices would never reach Leonard's ears. Leonard thought, that time, I should have been the one to die. But he had survived. Unable to even find a place to die, the blind hermit continues to wander aimlessly. Verdalay, the man of God, who hides inner conflict within his heart. Verdalay was worried. While he had the title of hierarch, sometimes he lost his understanding of God's true motives. Of course, even if he was hierarch, he was still no more than a single human being, and could not expect to foresee everything God willed. However, recent incidents had far surpassed Verdalay's understanding. The cult of the Watchers, the Imperial Army, and the goddess Furii. What in the world was God hoping for? Verdalay gazed at the adjoining room as he took a break from his writings. Beyond the single wall that separated them was the present goddess Furii's living room. Thinking of her, Verdalay felt an ache in his chest. At the tender age of 13, having still to recover from the trauma of seeing her parents slaughtered before her eyes, the girl had been separated from her brother and fiancé. Verdalay could not help but think that God had dealt her far too cruel a blow. When he first met Verdalay, there had been an emptiness in her eyes, not at all typical of a 14-year-old girl, the mere memory of which sent a shiver through his spine. She certainly appeared to be a pitiful girl on the outside, but the air she gave was entirely like that of an old woman on the verge of death. Furia was a hollow shell. As hierarch, Verdalay's duty was to ensure the safety of the goddess. Until now, the goddesses he had worked with had been obstinate at first, but many of them would open up towards him over time. However, Furia was different. It had already been several years since she became goddess, and yet he could count the number of times she had spoken to him on one hand. Of course, when he spoke to her, she never failed to reply, but the tone stayed quiet, and not once could a single sign of emotion be felt from her. Verdalay had now given up at all attempts to open her heart. At a time like this, if the dragon were here, his thoughts always found themselves wandering toward this conclusion. He had immense power, and gained respect from a great many people as hierarch. But in truth, this was a dreadfully lonely existence. If Verdalay gave a single command, tens of thousands of people would lay down their lives to carry it out, no matter how trivial. But more than that, what he really wanted was a single companion with which to converse as an equal. Before, the one to carry that role had been the dragon that was his pact partner, but the dragon had fossilized long ago and fallen into eternal sleep. A long sigh escaped from Verdalay's mouth. News of the war seemed to be coming in every day, notifying them that danger was approaching the castle they currently resided in. It seemed the day was not far off that he and the goddess would be living a life of vagrancy together. I wonder if I wonder if I'll be able to protect the goddess when the time comes. Oh God, give me strength! He let out an involuntary prayer, but there was no response. Alright, and that does it for our character novellas. Please leave a comment below, let me know what you thought of the video as a whole, and my reading of the novellas. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say, because I'm thinking about maybe after I finish the Drakengard Novellas and Drakengard 2 Novella, I'm thinking about maybe, I don't know, starting a series where I do, like, readings of other stuff, not just these novellas, like maybe, I don't know, a novel at some point, but that would be further down the road, of course, and it'd have to be related to video game. I already have one in mind, but, that all depends on you guys, if you want to hear an audiobook or something like that done by me, because that's basically what this is. But I've occupied enough time, so I'm just gonna let this run for I guess 20 more seconds for the end slate, and I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. See you in the next video.